All right, everybody, we're just going to go ahead and start. And folks come in, then we'll just sort of introduce them and when they come in. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time to sort of, you know, take some moments away from your busy schedules to learn about the wonder of pivot tables. We currently have a monthly professional development training that is what we like to call power hours. You can see our nice little infographic here that I have currently screen shared with you. We're going to go over very briefly before we start about just sort of how to use Zoom, just so everybody is familiar with the buttons and sort of all the little functions I might have you use throughout. And also, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about these sorts of just the programs that we have been using and that facilitates us to sort of do these power hours. So first things first, every first Wednesday of the month at noon, you're going to have the opportunity to come and see these. We also have, let me bring it up real quick. We have, first of all, just so you know, there is a, we got one more person sort of being admitted. Excellent. We have our chat box here. I have sort of sent a little message in the beginning of there. If you look at your toolbar for Zoom itself, you should see a little chat box button there. Let me see if I can show you currently. Let's just go to my screen. Yeah, if we can. So we should have a little chat box here somewhere. There we go, stop share. So down here at the bottom, you should all be able to see a few buttons. You have really the only ones that are that important are your participants button here. You're gonna be able to see some nice, interesting things that you can do with it. Can you all see the screen that I'm sharing with you okay? Yep,
Right now,
okay, great.
nothing's being shared.
What'd you say?
Right now, nothing's being shared.
And now, okay. Let's give this a second shot. Oh. Okay. There we go. Okay. So you should have, I guess it's not really letting me show you while I share the buttons that you're going to have, I guess, because these screen share buttons have a distinct set up at the top, but you should just be able to look down at the bottom. You should see a button, hopefully all of you can see mute, stop video, security, um, participants, things like that. There's also a chat button there. Really the only two I want you to worry about is the participants button. That will give you some options to sort of just tell me how things are going. You can go ahead and see some of the little selections you have there. I don't know if yours is going to look exactly like mine, but I have a yes and no, a go slower and go faster button. And then you should also have a sort of raise hand button. Those are all just things you can tell me throughout this little process here, because as you can kind of tell, Zoom has some interesting functions. And as we're all getting used to that sort of stuff, it can help me to sort of see what you're thinking. Secondly, we have a chat function over here, and it seems like most of you are already using that, so fantastic. So that is really the basics of what I'm really concerned about. So if you have any questions, if you have anything else, I'll try to sort of contact you as things progress. Obviously, I'll try my best, but just ping me or message again if I don't get to it around the first time. So second thing, just sort of some housekeeping is If you, all these sort of courses are going to be the smaller sections of a larger product that we've sort of like working on. So you will be able to access any of that sort of stuff just by, and other power hours as well if you want, if this really interests you, by messaging or sending an email to the email that I'm going to go ahead and put into the chat box right now. So you can, if you have any questions about these or any questions about more info for anything else really, anything that pertains to this meeting or any of the information we've discussed, you can go ahead and send an email to this email, minus the bracket that I put at the end there. So without further ado, we are going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to kind of see how everybody's doing. I see that most of you have your cameras off. That's totally fine. But I do like to sort of, get everybody talking a little bit. So hopefully that's not asking too much of you. Why don't you just tell me, each of you, your name and sort of what your familiarity is with Excel and pivot tables in general, I guess. So we can start with Enrique. How are you doing today, sir? Oh, I think you're muted, sir.
Yes, okay. Hello, I am Enrique. I am from Spain, Madrid.
Oh, great.
Today,
Wow.
today is 18 hours, 6 hours more than you. And I am familiar with pivot tables because I usually do a lot of reports in Excel using pivot tables.
Oh,
But
okay.
always, do you always you can understand little tricks and similar things. So for me, it's very useful to see this kind of meetings.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your input.
Thank you.
So let's go on to Darby. And by the way, I do want to say, if you're, uncomfortable with this, it is just a fun little thing I like to do at the beginning. You just tell me that. We'll move on forward. But if you're comfortable talking, Darby, I'd love to hear from just sort of how you doing and what do you think about Excel?
Hi, is it Michael or Mike?
Either one, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay, well, thanks for being here to give us the summary. I've been in the analytics space for over 15 years, so I'm
Wow.
familiar with
Yeah, there you go.
in Excel. I find them a tremendous power for summarizing data, quickly, so that you can kind of draw out insights when you need to. So I'd say I'm pretty familiar with it, but I'm always willing to learn more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fantastic. Good to have your expertise here. Thank you so much. We will go to Renee. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Renee.
I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, no, this is the fun of learning Zoom. I think we're all kind of, getting used to it together. How are you doing today?
I'm good, doing well, thank you.
Great to hear it. What is your familiarity with Excel or pivot tables, or just,
I use it quite a bit through work when I was at Ford Motor Company, so I just wanted to get a refresher on the pivot tables, but I've used Excel quite extensively.
Oh, great. Okay. So we're seeing quite a range of interests and skills. It's great to see. Thank you so much, Renee. Maureen?
Hi, everybody. So my background is in nursing, and I left the bedside a few years ago, and I'm doing more and more of office work, and so I'm not very familiar with Excel. I mean, I can get around it, but it seemed like the pivot tables might come in handy. So thanks. I appreciate all the information you're going to give us.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Thank you so much. I see also Ben has entered as well. I think that I know kind of your skill set on that, but if you would like to introduce yourself, you can feel free to do so.
Hello, hello. If I didn't have Michael on one side of me or my AA on the other side of me for Excel, I would be lost. So I can certainly use the help.
Okay. Well, thank you all for taking the time to come here and talk. And without further ado, if I think I hit everything. If not, I'm sure Sheila, you'll let me know. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So again, bear with me. This is kind of my my first time using this whole Zoom program as the instructor. So let me know if there's anything I'm missing, as I'm going to be navigating several sort of windows here. So hopefully, you will all get something out of this. This is definitely going to be more intermediate, generally speaking. This is part of technically the level 2 program that we teach. So some of you are very, very skilled. Some of you not so much. Some of you in the middle. If you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to leave them in the chat box. I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. And if you have anything else that you would like to follow up with, feel free to do so. So first things first, what is a pivot table? What's the point of them? What are we doing with them? I'm going to now primarily be sharing my screen just so you can kind of see what I'm doing here. I'm going to get it to share if it wants to go. There we go. All right. So here I have a sort of just basic set of data that we have here as sort of generic sort of information. None of this is private information, so you don't need to worry about that. This is just specifically made for the purposes of working with this sort of stuff, getting your sort of skills right. You can actually I can drop a link real quick about where you might get this. There is some practice information with there is some practice information with a website called 30bird. I put that in the chat. You could probably just pop them to Google, and then you can search for files on that if you would like after this to practice yourself. I mean, you could take the time to go get it now if you want, but I'm going to be going through this stuff fairly rapidly, so don't feel under any compulsion to do so. It just gives you a nice set of data that you can sort of work with, mess with, without really having to mess with work files or construct all of it yourself. So we have a nice table here. We have some cleanly sort of organized information, much more so than myself. I don't know about you, but I'm not exactly the extremely organized type. So it's nice to work with data like this. Why would we want to use a pivot table for something in a situation like this? Well, it can give us some control over how we look at the data by sort of parsing it out into pieces and allowing us to construct it, manipulate it, see the sort of different ways you can represent it. And it's all fairly simple just by working with a few buttons, basically, that Excel gives to us. So if we are on the Excel window here, just a few sort of housekeeping concepts. So we have our ribbon here up at the top. Hopefully most of you know what that is, but in case you're unfamiliar, just as a way to sort of organize the information that we have here. We have various buttons that are in groups, so you can see clipboard, font. I'm going to use my fancy new thing that I did with my clicker, where you should be able to see this right there. The nice circle sort of animation I'll let you see what I'm pointing at. So you have all these different groups that have various different similar functions put together that allow you to easily access stuff. So we have a bunch of different buttons here for everything. Really, creating a pivot table out of data, something like this, if you have your data fairly organized, is as simple as clicking the pivot table button. So it would be under the Insert tab up at the top, and then the pivot table button right now. So when you see something like this, again, what this is first doing is usually Excel is pretty good about this. You will see that it grabs the information that you have. I clicked inside of the table first itself, just to give it a sort of sense of what I'm trying to talk about, and then it's going to try to essentially see what you're looking at, see the data that you're trying to get, and make a reasonable guess as to where it's starting and where it's stopping. So first things first, this is sort of niche, but oops, it's sort of niche, but I tend to point this out just to show folks in case maybe this is something that you learned a long time ago and you are not quite as updated about, or if maybe you didn't get this the first time around. When you see something like this, at first it's like, whoa, what is this? What is all this information that we see here? This is essentially giving you the range for what is going to be included in your pivot table. So first thing we notice is we have invoices here, invoices exclamation mark. That's referring to the sheet that we're talking about. So when we look down here, we can clearly see that the only sheet we really have is this invoices sheet. But if we had 9 or 10 or 12 or however many sheets down here, this is going to clearly indicate essentially where we're getting our information from. So we can clearly tell, okay, we're in the right place. We didn't somehow click something and we're in a completely different tab. No problem. We know we're in the right area. Next, we have $A, $9, colon, $H, $1007. So what this is referring to is first, it basically, first is just the A9, which would be the date currently right here. Oh, whoops, I've added something in here by clicking. I should have known better than that. And secondly, it's going to, I can't really show you where it is, but it's way, 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 way down at the bottom. Just like any range you would use, the colon refers to the end portion of it, of this range, H1007. So if you read this together, this portion right here, it's saying starting at A9, which would be date, ending at H1007. So for us, because this is so neatly organized and so easily sort of digestible, we can easily see what it's referring to. It's saying basically the entire table of data that we currently have selected. Everything from the beginning of the table set, which is A9, all the way down to the bottom, which is more than, well, almost 1,000 cells, down way, 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 way down the bottom. The dollar signs only refer to essentially, really the thing that you need to worry about that is that it's not a relative reference. It's not going to change based on if you copy and paste that somewhere else, which is important when you're creating some sort of information-based, image based off of information. You don't want that stuff to suddenly be, referring to a completely different data set if you copy or paste something wrong. So usually when you see something like that, you're going to get these absolute references, which are going to stay in place. Now, again, if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed, or if you're perhaps the other side of that, where you're like, yeah, this is basic stuff, of course. The only reason I mention this is you don't need to worry about it too much, but this is just how you can sort of read this in case you are completely confused as to what is being grabbed. It's essentially just saying everything on this this sheet from this point of A9 through down to the point of H7, which is exactly what we want. So once we do that, we can choose, do we want it on a new worksheet or do we want it on an existing worksheet? This again is just where this pivot table is going to show up. So we are going to be fine with a new worksheet. We're just going to click OK. So now gets to the fun part. After we have gone through, made sure that our data is right, our where we want it to be located, we've gone through the hard work of sort of setting this information up. Because you got to imagine that it's you doing this, you setting this stuff up. You've already gone through quite a bit of effort. We want something that's not going to be too necessarily complex, and that's exactly what pivot tables allows us to do. We're going to be able to manipulate this stuff based on each of the sections that we're talking about. So right now, you don't see anything because we haven't shown where we want each of those fields to go. We have 4 different selections here that allows us to sort of dictate where each of those sections is going to go. So first thing, let us go ahead and put our rep, which in this case refers to somebody who is sort of selling any sort of sale. This is kind of a vague, coffee, tea company is the kind of idea behind it. We're imagining that we are working on that sort of stuff. Imagine we are the person behind the analytics and the sort of bookkeeping for this. So we're trying to figure out what is the best way that we can make, we can sort of organize this stuff. Well, you can, of course, just click the button here. So click rep. And when you do that, it will automatically assume what it thinks the best place that's going to go is. So it thinks that a rep, based on the type of information that we have here, would make the most sense as a row field. And that's not a terrible assumption. That's pretty reasonable. We have our labels here for each of these different people, from Blackwell down to Westlean, alphabetically organized. And it's essentially saying that we have put it in that order there. Now, if we don't like that, if we decide that actually, now we want to make something with more of a column for each of the reps, all we have to do is drag it over to the columns. And now it's going to be organized with our reps as a column rather than as a row. So again, this is really the power behind these sort of programs. This is what it gives you as a basically the mechanism to organize this stuff to make it more your own, rather than just the sort of staple graph or table that you would get if you just click that. So the second part, of course, one section of this isn't really going to do much for us. We've nicely organized it, but that's not too valuable to us. Now what we want to do is we want to have something else. We want to basically pick from these selections here and ask ourselves what would make the most sense to go into the row column, or row field rather. So I would suggest that item would probably be a good choice. So again, we're imagining item as our different products, right? So now we have two pretty reasonable selections here. We have our columns, which are our reps, so the people that are selling these products, and then we have our rows, which are the various kinds of products that we're selling. So now we have successfully selected those few things. We need the last portion of this, at least the last portion for the most basic makeup for this stuff, which is, in our case, total sale. Now, you could use units if you just wanted to figure out how many units of something was sold. You could put the cost. You could even put the region if you wanted to see, what that would look like. But for us, we're just going pretty basic. What is the total sale per person per product? So if we go ahead and we drag that down to values, we can see now each person's specific sale per product is being highlighted. So we can see the Blackwell here has the, I believe the lowest, nope, that would be Tucana Roast would be the lowest for him. Whereas with Vela Herbal, we have quite a reasonable sales quota for him for this section. So this just sort of gives you a little bit of insight into how to manipulate this data. It lets you sort of select specifically which things you're working with, which areas you are interested in, and allows you to very easily, I mean, again, if we wanted to switch this up, all we would have to do is switch the two locations that we had them in. So we can put rep back into rows, then we can put item back into columns, and there you go. It's ultimately very, very easy to do that. So before I continue, I know that was quite a bit of information, but that's sort of the basics of how to get a pivot table to work. Is there any questions on that so far? Trying to keep up with the chat, but I don't think anybody has said anything. Nope. So go ahead, and if you have any questions, you can just put it in the chat, or you can say it to me right now. I'll wait a minute just to make sure everybody is sort of on the same page. Wow, okay. So seems like y'all are pretty good on this. So that is just the most basic element of this. If I'm just going a little too fast and you actually did have a question, feel free to put it into the chat. I'll get to it eventually. But just to continue onward, we have a lot of different selections that we can use to sort of change the stuff as we go, now that we have the basics of our table put together. So first of all, you can't, I hope that you can see this based on the change we have here. Oh, great. I'm glad that you are liking it. So Ben asks, can I do that to a sheet that has already been created by someone else that shared it with me? So as long as you have the ability to edit it, some sheets are going to be locked as a view only sheet. But as long as you have the ability to edit the sheet, you should be able to do that, yeah. That was just under Ben's question in the chat. So the next thing we're going to go to is this section up here in the ribbon. You should be able to see, I'm trying to get to it without the screen sharing thing coming down, but there's a little bit of a darker green selection over towards the right of the tabs at the top. So it's right actually to the left of tell me what you want to do here, which is actually a very useful sort of tool that you can use to if you don't quite remember what Excel, where the button is. So like if you were like, for say, trying to search for something within your document, you can always just search something in here and it will help you find it. But right to the left of that, whenever you are working with something or manipulate something that you've created, so if you're working with a graph, if you're working with a chart, if you're working with a table, anything like that, even a picture, you will see a selection that's a little bit darker green than all the other tabs over here. So this is essentially, you can know that that is specific to whatever you're working on, whatever you've selected. So if I say click off, it's gone up there, no longer exists. It's only when I'm clicked onto whatever I'm working on that it will suddenly pop up again. So remember that if you're working on a project, that's one of the biggest like complaints that I've heard people talk about is like, where do all my options go? Is because you have to always be clicked on whatever project you're working on. In this case, we're working on a pivot table, but it would be the same if you were working on a chart, for example. So we have two new selections here. We have Analyze, which is going to allow us to work with the data that we're talking about. And we have Design. So each of these sort of has different functions you can use that are specific to your pivot table. I mean, unsurprisingly, given that it only exists for that specific purpose. So we can start with a slicer. So I think a slicer is pretty fun to work with. If you click on your insert slicer selection here, it's going to allow us to very easily and quickly work through data without actually getting rid of the data. So for example, if I create, I'll do a rep slicer actually. So if I click rep, just keep this in your mind. Look at sort of what this looks like right now. Now if I click rep and click OK, I'm going to get this nice little pop-up here that gives me all the different reps associated with this. So I'm trying to put this over so you can see all this. Hopefully you can see it okay. So as I click on these various people, it's going to give me the option of just looking at them particularly. Now this is not limited just to our one person. If you hold Control while you click, you're able to click multiple people at a time. So if I wanted to say include Blackwell, Franklin, Lloyd, and McCanny, all I have to do is first click on whichever person I'm interested in, hold the Control key on your keyboard, click whoever is next in line while you're still holding the Control key, and then just keep doing that until you have everybody that you're interested in seeing. So that's a very quick and easy way of comparing people, especially if you have a large set of data. Like you saw initially before we created this, there was over 1,000 rows in our set of information, and we were able to pare it down a bit. But sometimes you really are going to be working with that massive amount of data. A slicer is a very quick and easy way for you to sort of sift through it without actually getting rid of that data, underlying data. We still have everything there. We can still choose to have all of it selected if we want. So for example, if you're trying to select everything again, you can just click on the first person, the top or bottommost person, go down to the top or bottommost, hold Shift on your keyboard, and then click the last person. And then they'll all be included again. Alternatively, if you have any sort of filter settings, you can always just click this button up here where it says Clear Filter. Again, I'm trying to get as much information as possible within a relatively short period of time, so I hope I'm not speaking too fast. Are there any questions on what I just covered? Okay, great. If you have questions, again, feel free to put it in the chat box. No problem. I'll get to it at some point. So don't feel intimidated if I don't get to it immediately. All right, so now we have now successfully essentially created our first pivot table, and we've now found a way to work through the information very quickly. What else can we do with it? Well, first of all, we can essentially manipulate the source data if, for example, oh great, I'm glad to hear that the pace is good. So if we have a sort of issue with the data that we're working with, how does slicer differ from filter? So a slicer is a kind of filter. It's essentially just a more advanced standalone type of filter. So let me give you an example of what you can do without the slicer in of itself. So if I go to row labels here, and I click on this little button right here for row labels, I'm still going to get filter options here. I'm still going to be able to, like any table, be able to sort it, be able to choose different labels for filters, do value filters, or search. I'll do a few of those just so you can sort of see folks who may not be familiar with that may be able to get something out of that. So if I, for example, want to include anything that, do I have somebody that has two S's? Yes. So anything that begins with the letter S, I can go to in the row labels. I can click this section right here, this little drop down for row labels. And then I can go to label filters, and I get a bunch of different options for how I want to filter this information. Same way that we did with the slicer, it's just a little bit different. I can choose any of these, but I'm just going to do, let's see, begins with, and then I can choose anything that begins with whatever I put in, and it should sort of select that information for me. So I'm going to do begins with S, press OK, and now it's going to essentially give me just those folks whose names begin with S. And just like in the slicer, how we have our clear filter button right here, I can click on this and then do clear filter from rep, and once again we get the information again. So it's essentially just a faster way of working with basic filtering choices. So we can still sort, we can still do multi-select, we can still do a lot of the basic things that we talked about. It's just a fast and easy way if you know you're going to be working with a lot of data and you're going to have to be comparing things very quickly. If I did that over in the labels here, if I went here, let's say I wanted to compare Hernandez and Blackwell. Well, I would have to click here where it says select all. Then I would have to click Hernandez and Blackwell and click OK. And then it does what I wanted it to do, but look how easy that is here. Rather than going through all those clicks, I can just click Blackwell, hold control, Hernandez, and there you go. It's the exact same thing, it's just a little bit faster. You'll notice that Excel gives us a lot of different options for doing the same thing. It's just about sort of optimizing how quickly you're able to do it. And particularly since a few of you are pretty significantly skilled with Excel, after a certain point, it's less about learning completely new functions with some of this stuff and more about just optimizing your time so that you're able to go through it quicker. Oh, no problem. I'm very happy to help. All right, so let's see what else we can do. So I was talking about changing source data. So if you go into the Analyze tab up here, again, notice that I'm still in the pivot table itself because again, those options are only going to show up if I'm in the table. If I click on Change Source Data, it's going to bring me back to that initial setting. So let's say, for example, that I wanted a different set of data to be addressed. So let's say that in this specific source data doesn't really necessarily help me. Let's imagine that we had everything ordered by date, for example, and I only wanted to deal with information beyond a certain date or in front of a certain date. I can alter the amount of data that I'm working with. So if I just want to go through the first 100 selections here, oops. just like I talked about earlier, how this is just basically referring to, first of all, the Invoices tab down here, the start point, A9, which is date currently, and then the end point, it was originally H1007. I can alter that, and we can see that change reflected in who is showing up now in our table here. So we still have all of our settings, even though we changed that. We still have columns are item, rows are rep, values are sum total. So essentially, we still are comparing how many sales these people did for each of their selections. But now we have limited the information we have to such a point that only Hernandez and Franklin are showing up. And notice that even Hernandez doesn't have anything currently with Phoenix Roast. So in our current case, that wouldn't be extremely useful, but if you find yourself dealing with a large amount of data and you want to compare or perhaps create multiple pivot tables, maybe one for each of the years, or one for each of the people, or one for each of the selections. Really, it's up to whatever is interesting to you. Note that you can always just change this section right here where it says table range, select table or range, and you can alter that to be whatever you want. You just need to make sure that you're on the right sheet, which is invoices, exclamation point. You're in the right start point, which is A9, date, and then you're in the right endpoint, which again, I'm going to go back to our normal endpoint because we want all of our data. And it comes right back. So you can do that as many times as you need, as long as you do not in any way affect the original data that we talked about, as long as you don't delete any of it in this right here. As long as you're not like going into here and deleting things or changing things, putting things in different places, creating a pivot table isn't going to in any way alter that original data. So you can do whatever you want here and do it knowing that it's not going to in any way hamper your original data collection, which is good because sometimes you do have to make several different comparisons and you do a lot of different stuff with the data. So does that make sense? Any questions? I'll leave it for maybe 10 seconds. Just let me know if you have a question. Give me about anything. Doesn't specifically have to be about that. Okay, great. So as we continue on, so let's see here. So we have a lot of different things that we can get to. One thing I do want to touch on at least a little bit is the design. Design is interesting because for a few reasons. First, I usually tell folks, especially if you are, doing this for your job, doing this for something you're working on. A lot of people ask me, what would be the point of having a different design? Why wouldn't you just go with the default every time? And you could, but remember that a lot of this sort of stuff, particularly when you're creating pivot charts, pivot tables, stuff like that, it's as much about the presentation of the data as the data itself. There's a reason why we're creating a pivot table. The point of it is to get the most out of the data that we're working with. We could have just shown them this massive chart here, right? But there's a reason that we condensed it down into this selection. It's because people don't want to read 1,000 different entries in an Excel file, right? They just want to see what is relevant, what is important, what do we need to know, and it doesn't hurt to have that information be easily readable and easily sort of enjoyable as much as any sort of Excel file can be. So the basics for this is just sort of keep that in mind. You're not just making an aesthetic choice, you're making an aesthetic choice for a purpose. What am I highlighting? What am I not highlighting? What you don't show is sometimes as important as what you do show and what you do highlight. So the options that we have here are, we have right here in this section up here, what they call pivot table styles. So this is going to give us a different sort of selection for each of these. Now, a few things to keep in mind when you're picking a style is, first of all, is it going to be straining on the eyes? Is it going to be uncomfortable? What does it show? What does it highlight? So, and secondly, also keep in mind, this is something a lot of people forget, is some folks are colorblind. So we don't necessarily want to have something that is going to affect that if you're unsure of whether or not the person is colorblind. Particularly if you're doing like a chart or something like that, if you're like trying to show this big change in something and you give a colorblind person a chart with a whole bunch of different colors, it might look nice, but they might not be able to tell the difference of what you're referring to, and that can kind of defeat the point of what you were alluding to. So what I like to do is I like to give it something that is just, you know, a little bit not easy on the eyes, not anything too much. I'm just gonna go with something like that. That's fine. And now we can see how it immediately changes along with this. But that's not the only option that we get. We get row headers for this. So you can see, in our case, it doesn't really affect us too much. It's our column headers that are really the interesting ones. You can see as our column headers sort of bleep in, bleep out, we have banded rows here. Some folks like this. Some folks think that this is a little bit easier to see. Again, it's up to your taste, but you can also include banded columns as well. Some folks swear by them. Some folks don't really like them too much. It's really up to you which you consider to be the most viable. But again, be thinking about utility when you do these things as well. It's not just about aesthetic. Secondly, we can also get a few choices here. So we get different layout options, which we can sort of show here. I'm not sure if it'll be too significant. You can see a few. We have a fairly small one, so it's not that significant. But you can see a few changes here in the style. You can see how in tabular form we get these different clearly marked sections for each one of them. Each of the cells gets easily identifiable. In the outline form, it's less so. It's just sort of like focusing on that. And then in compact form, everything is sort of condensed into as little space as possible. Generally speaking, you want to compact things more if you have more data, just because it doesn't take up quite as much space. Now, the sort of big one is grand totals. This is sort of a very interesting one, and can be important depending on the kind of data you have. Sometimes you're going to get data where they already do a grand total for you. They have some sort of you know, a formula or function that they've just very quickly put together to add things together. You don't want duplicates, so make sure that you're looking out for that. And sometimes you'll have something where the grand total for the row or column is going to be the same. So there's no point in having both a row grand total and a column grand total if it's just going to be a duplication. Now, in our case, each person is individual. So we can see Franklin, Hernandez, Sanchez, etc. This grand total over here is just for them, each one of these. But then we have a grand total down here for the various products that we're selling. So we have Indus Tea. You can see the grand total for that, specifically Phoenix Roast, etc. And then we have the final one right down here, which is a combination of the two. We can see what the grand total of all sales essentially is. So again, these are little things, not seemingly that important, but if you take the time to actually put in the work to make the design interesting, you think about things like disability, think about things like what would be most effective for everybody that we're looking at, and make sure that you're not doubling up on anything. And you're going to start to create something that is just shows you put the time and effort in to make this readable, and is going to engage your audience more, so that essentially they've seen you put the work in, so they are going to be more willing to read it and pay attention to it. They see something where it's just kind of slapped together, things are repeated, you know, you haven't put much effort into the color to see if it meets everybody's disability needs. They're not going to be incentivized to read through all of it and sort of get to the point that you're making. So this is sort of the basic elements for that. Our section actually puts together in this sort of learning program that we put together, it actually puts together pivot charts with pivot tables. So I guess I'll just ask all of you, are you interested in learning about pivot charts specifically, or do you want more of a focus on pivot tables? Anybody can speak up. I'm happy. I mean, I'll just go along with what the curriculum is if you want. But given we only have 10 minutes left, I want to make sure that your time is used the most effectively. So if anybody has a perspective, please let me know.
Can you quickly show us a pivot chart?
I'm sorry?
Can you quickly show us a pivot chart?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah, fantastic. Well, it seems like most folks are interested in the chart, so let's do it. So pivot charts are also very similar to this, in fact. So that's kind of, I think, why they pair them together, even though they are distinct entities. Is the idea is that they are very sort of using a lot of the same principles that we're talking about. So I'm gonna actually, oh, Excel did not like that very much. Oh, well, Excel crashed, so give me 1 second. Well, while we wait for Excel to open up, do we, oh, there we go. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go over here, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did for our pivot chart. So again, you're just gonna make sure that you click inside our data. We're just gonna use the exact same data that we used. Is my screen still being shared with you, or are you just seeing my face right now?
No, just your face.
Just your face.
Okay, let's put it back on there. Sorry about that. I don't know why it crashed on me. So let's, yeah, okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So pivot chart, now that you have the basics for pivot tables, going to be very, very easy because it's essentially using those same elements. So just like you would a pivot table, click inside the area that you want your data to be selected from. But rather than going over to the pivot table selection all the way over to the left, again, we're still in the Insert tab. Go almost over to the end of the charts group, and you should see a pivot chart selection. Go ahead and click on that. And you're going to, behold, see yet again another nice little selection here for us. And we're familiar with this by this point. It's the exact same thing. Invoices, perfect. That's the tab that we're interested in. A9 through H1007, again, perfect. Exactly the sort of information that we're interested in. Again, we can choose to put it to if we want to draw from an external source, we can do that. We can create a new worksheet or use an existing one. We're just going to go ahead and create a new one. All right. So let's go ahead and see what the exact same thing we did before. Let's see what it looks like using the exact same kind of data, but on a chart instead. So we are going to go ahead and put our reps, and we can choose where we want them. So we can do any one of these. I'm going to do axis for rep. And then we can do, say, item. We can, again, put them into any one of these selections. We can put that into legend. And then we can do, again, any of our values here. We're going to go ahead and put that into values. And there you go. Just like we had last time, although they have different names, notice that we have legend here rather an axis rather than column and row. It's effectively going to be the same principle that we're working with. We're just working with the columns and rows for the chart itself. The legend serves as this selection right here. Hopefully you can see that okay. We can see our different brands here. We can see our different people here, our different reps down at the bottom. Now, here, the interesting part of a chart versus a table, even though it's essentially the same elements that we're working with, is that a chart, even more than a pivot table, is all about representation. So we can, work with this sort of information here, but it's sort of clunky potentially. So what really works for charts, what I tend to tell people to focus on, is try to find the chart that is going to be the most effective for what you're trying to do. So in this case, design is more than just aesthetics. It really is it can make or break your chart essentially. So we have in the chart here, we can choose from different chart selections here, same way that we did before. All different kinds, but again, keep in mind the same sort of interests that you have there. Oh, well, it wants to crash again, but hopefully it'll recover. Sorry about this, y'all. Okay, let's get back to there. Okay, I'm gonna very quickly try to get this open here. Insert chart. Go. Total sale. Okay, so as I was saying, the design that you use, I'm just not going to test my system, which apparently cannot handle that. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it onto this specific design. Now, again, I'm sort of breaking my own rules here just because there's a lot of different colors here. But in this case, you need to kind of represent these things in one way or another. Now, we have a basic design here, but even more important than the design, oh, let me screen share again. There we go. So even more important than the design that we're talking about, so I just have it on this sort of basic design here, you have a button up at the top in the design section called Change Chart Type. And this really is the single most, in my opinion, useful button for pivot charts. So if you click that, you're going to get a whole lot of different options here for different kinds of information. Now, again, same way as before, it's not going to alter the data itself. So the underlying data, you don't got to worry about that being disrupted in any way, shape, or form. Really, it's just about how it's being represented, what is being shown. And they really do have some interesting stuff. There's a, where's the one? Surface, here we go. So you have like a interesting surface map like that too. But in our case, I think I'm just gonna go with a line chart. I think a line chart would probably be better for this. Now, even once you've selected the kind that you're choosing from, you also have other types up here. So you can have a stacked line versus just a regular line. You can have a 100% stacked line with markers. I think I'll actually use the line with markers for this one. So I'm going to sort of give an indication of the data points that I'm talking about in addition to the line chart. So I click OK, and there you go. You can see that it is very quickly updated. It didn't take, even on my system that is crashing like 3 times with this thing, it's still very, very quick to update the sort of information you have. Now, last sort of very quick thing is you can switch the columns and rows. This is a very quick way to deal with problems if you have an unwieldy chart. I would recommend just trying it out and seeing if it changes it for the better or worse. Because watch, if we do this here, look how bad this becomes. I mean, it's reasonable, right? It's not like it's exceptionally terrible, but compared to something like this, where there's only 4 lines you have to focus on, I guess either one has a different advantage to it. In this case, everything's sort of clumped together. Everything's sort of very, very close to each other. Whereas with this one, you have sort of a more things to look at, but there's a wider range of information that you can look at. Okay, I think that someone is talking to me in chat, if I can get to it. Chat. I'm going to stop share real quick. Okay, so thank you again. Is there any way to enlarge pivot field window? Yes. So if you are interested, last thing I'll show you, since we're getting close on time, let me very quickly show you how to do that. If you are trying to enlarge anything on here, all you have to do is, if you want to change the image itself, see on these little balls right here, the white balls, you can drag them, make it bigger. If you're just trying to change the window, you can go down to the bottom and zoom it. So hopefully you can see this down here at the bottom here. Okay, so now, unfortunately, I do have to wrap up. I will try to address the questions if I can get this thing to stop. So